Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, depending on where you are. And thank you for making the time to attend this panel and to attend the entirety of the panel and the program, the third edition of the E3 Student Conference and Exhibition. That's Earth, Energy, and Environment. The title of this particular panel is AI Solutions for a Greener Future, Advancements in those three themes, Earth, Energy, and Environment. And I'm really honored today to be hosting this panel and facilitating the Q&A. And so I'll start by introducing myself, and then I'll briefly introduce our panelists and let them say a bit more about, what they do before we delve into some prepared questions. So my name is Hani Elshahawi. I am founder and managing director of NoviDigiTech, which is really my consultancy. I work primarily as an advisor to startups in the digital domain. A lot of them are companies on AI and machine learning and related topics. Prior to the last 3 years, since I've been doing this, I was with Shell, most recently as digitalization lead for deep water technology, worked in a program called Game Changer, and also worked as a technology strategy advisor. I was there for 18 years, and prior to that, I was with Schlumberger, now SLB, for another 15 years, working product development, sales and marketing, as well as field operations. So, as I mentioned, we have three esteemed speakers today: Camilo from Enovate, Siddharth from Texas A&M, and Ashwin from Resermine. And I'll let them each introduce themselves in a little bit more detail and give a bit of background about what they do right now before we'll delve into some questions. So maybe over to you, Camilo.
So really, thank you, Hani, and thank you, everybody, for the invitation and for having me here. So I'm Camilo Mejia. I'm leading Enovate. Enovate is a technology company that focus on the energy sector. We kind of work in the middle between oil and gas and the low carbon energy. And I look forward to all the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Sid?
Thanks a lot, Hani, for that introduction. Thanks a lot for the invite. I'm a professor in Texas A&M University. My focus is data analytics, machine learning for E&P, carbon storage. I have a research group that is called DICE, and with the DICE research group, we try to help operators and service companies develop technologies that they can use in their E&P projects. So with that, I'm looking forward to our discussion today.
Very good, thank you. Ashwin, I'm not sure if you're already relocated, if you're able to turn your camera on shortly, but you can just say a couple of words as well.
Yeah? Sure, can you hear me?
If you come closer to the mic a little bit, it's a bit faint.
Hi, Hani. My name is Ashwin. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Very excited to participate in this event. My background, I've been with Shell for over 15 years. Was also a faculty at University of Oklahoma. 8 years ago, we started this company called Resermine because we felt the need for solutions in this space. We specifically work on reservoir surveillance and management, trying to automate that using machine learning and analytics and what we call hybrid models. We recognize not a single model is able to really solve all the problems. So essentially, how do you combine different models to address specific challenges in the subsurface? And very excited to participate, share some of our experience of deploying things globally, and looking forward to also learning from my fellow panelists. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you all. I'm going to say a few words just to preface kind of the topic today, And one area which I've worked on quite a bit and continue to is this whole space of digital. And people talk a lot about digital transformation, which is encompasses a bunch of things. But what is digital transformation, at least in my understanding? It's simply speaking about orchestrating the physical world more efficiently by turning data into insights, and then turning those insights ultimately to some action or decision. And you're going to see attributes of that in much of what we'll discuss today. AI is one of the principal tools in digital transformation. It's not the only one, but it's a major one. So in essence, then, to digitalize something is to use data to do a number of things that are transformative to your business. Standardize, automize or automate, optimize, prophesize, which means predicting things, monetize, customize. Those are the kinds of things that digital allows you to do. And digital and AI are really not new, but they're not the same old either. It's the exponential nature of the change that's really the hallmark of digital transformation that's new. So, for example, in 2006, the top 5 companies by market cap were ExxonMobil, General Electric, Total, Microsoft, and Citibank. Only a decade later, those top companies were Apple, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and Facebook. So except for Microsoft, all of these companies emerged during the recent internet boom. And 3 of them, Google, Amazon, and Facebook, were established with data aggregation, analysis, and customer centricity at the core of their business model. So that's really the essence of digital transformation and how disruptive it has been. Now, AI and digital transformation are more important now than ever before, especially to our industry, because the industry is facing really unprecedented, the whole world really is unprecedented change. You got more competition, more complexity, less predictability. The profit margins are under pressure. The prospect of rapid energy transition is real. And then the margin of error for survival is really shrinking. So combine that now with the fact that you've got a significant big crew change that has already been happening and is accelerating, and you can see the magnitude of the challenge. So digital, and specifically the use of AI and machine learning, becomes one of the few tools available to our industry to really transform itself in order to cope with those multitude of challenges. So I'm going to go around and ask a few questions, and please, whichever one, I'll start with one of you, and then each of you who would like to comment or add, please chip in. So I'll start with you, Camilo, this time. I'm going to ask you, what flavor of artificial intelligence are you focused on, and how is it, in your opinion, differentiated from other approaches?
Really, thank you, Hani, and thank you for the introduction as well. I think from our side and from my personal point of view, digital transformation in the energy sector is also about kind of supporting the industry to be more proactive, perhaps more progressive. I think the energy sector historically is a huge industry, is being kind of blessed to some extent with the amount of cash flows, even though there is volatility in the market. And that is really leading to a status quo in terms of how we manage engineering processes, which is where we focus on. I think the energy industry is really huge, is really big, different layers, now even more rich in terms of the low carbon market. So I think when it comes down to AI, there are so many kind of classifications, how many, I don't even know, the different flavors. But if we go to a very simplistic way, we look AI in 2 different categories based on kind of capabilities and based on functionality. If we talk about AI based on capabilities, we are looking at probably general AI from an engineering standpoint. Our goal is about delivering workflow automation for specific practices within the upstream domain. And we really focus about enabling professionals and engineers with more progressive workflows, more proactive workflows. that covers so many kind of points from drilling to production in the traditional upstream oil and gas industry, and now going into the low carbon market, areas like geothermal, carbon storage, they actually come probably more forward-looking kind of thinking, just because the requirements in order to monetize all these kind of environmental claims. So to answer your question, Hani, we focus on kind of general AI, very focused on capabilities to enable or to support engineers to be more proactive in decision making for different pieces of the upstream domain.
Thank you, Camilo. Sid, maybe if you can comment on sort of the approaches that you have specifically focused on. And
yeah. So I'm coming from an academic center. In academic center, we generally don't do anything commercial as such, mostly. So my focus has been to push the frontiers of new applications, new methods that can be brought into E&P, right? So one of my active interest right now is an unsupervised method, which is called manifold learning. Now, unsupervised methods, why am I so excited about? Because at this moment, there's not a lot of commercial application of unsupervised methods. Most of the applications are supervised. What it means is we have a bunch of inputs, we generate labels, and we try to connect them. So that's supervised. In unsupervised, there are no labels required. With absence of labels, you can do very rapid analysis of your data. And then you can bring in a lot of your domain knowledge to identify or to give meaning to the results that you obtained using unsupervised method. So the one that I'm excited about is called manifold learning. So let me just explain how it is different in terms of its flavor. Let's say you have a square piece of paper and a triangular piece of paper. You crumple them. I crumpled a square piece of paper and a triangular piece of paper. If you crumple them, they will look similar. It's only when you understand the manifold in the sense, this entire paper crumpled up, if you flatten it up, it's only when you flatten it up, you'll see the square or the triangle. So that's manifold learning. We are trying to use manifold learning on signals that are representative of 3D motions. So we are kind of uncrumpling the 3D motions and understanding the similarities or dissimilarities between different 3D motions that are generated due to microseismic events, which can help better understand the hydraulic fractures that are produced during stimulation. So that's one flavor that I'm exploring. The other flavor is called neural operator. Now, the word operator is something like a differential operator or a differentiation or integration. You give a function, you generate a function. So a neural operator helps us achieve function to function mapping. Because of this function to function mapping, we can try to learn how a partial differential equation generates a solution. And once we learn that, we can use it for purposes of forecasting, how the pressure plume will migrate, how the saturations will migrate. All that can be learned and predicted rapidly as a function to function mapping. The methods that are currently popular, such as convolutional neural network, LSTM, what they do vector to vector mapping. They don't do function to function mapping. So this neural operator is another flavor that I'm exploring.
thank you. And apologies, Ahmed, for Dr. Suleiman. If you can please make Ashwin into a panelist again, that would be appreciated. But let me go on to kind of the next question I had in mind until we can get Ashwin back also so he can comment. But if you can comment, Camilo, on how AI solutions can improve operational performance, enhance safety, or reduce the environmental impact of existing oil and gas operations, and some of the work you've been doing, that would be fantastic.
Absolutely, Hani. I think there are so many kind of opportunities, and I do agree with the panelists talking today. I think the fact is we are going through an entire evolution where so many models and so many opportunities will be untapped by not only research and development, but also operational opportunities. To answer your question, Hani, one of the projects that we have been successfully deploying for E&P operators in the drilling aspect is a kind of multi-layered perceptron deep learning kind of model where we are taking historical data from the observed wells and really looking at minimizing the inputs for the model to optimize kind of drilling efficiency. That drilling efficiency could be a function of rate of penetration or kind of how fast you can drill the wells. It could be also based on advanced or proactive events detection for downhole vibration mitigation. So that particular model has been very successful for us. It's really about minimizing the inputs and providing proactive decision making in order to really change kind of operational factors as they drill the wells. That's kind of an example for increasing efficiencies, minimizing risk. In some other opportunities, I think a very kind of successful model, convolutional neural networks were deployed in order to really minimize the requirements for formation evaluation data. I think, depending where you are kind of exploring hydrocarbons, and I'm talking about oil and gas per minute, there are some markets that are not really generous when it comes down to formation evaluation. And I'm talking specifically about logging requirements or geophysical logging requirements. So the kind of convolutional neural network was very essential in order to really multiply the existence data and minimize risk in the development of specific oil and gas projects. So I think many opportunities across upstream in traditional oil and gas. And I think from a carbon storage standpoint, the ability to really come up with more kind of outputs from the models that can guide operators injecting CO2 to minimize liabilities. Carbon storage is all about liabilities at the end of the story. I think it's very well received. So just to give you some examples about specific models, multi-layer perceptron, deep learning in drilling, convolutional neural networks, information evaluation. I think there is different cases we can talk about, but just to mention a few.
Thank you for that. Sid, you want to also talk about how can some of the AI solutions you're working on or that you're aware of do the same?
Okay. So I'll give you 3 examples of how AI can help improve safety, reduce environmental impact. The first one will be related to water production. So when we produce from unconventional shales, sometimes what happens is certain regions, they produce a lot of water, and this produced water needs to be disposed. Now, if you can preemptively predict which regions will be excessive water producers, then the entire reservoir management and the produced water disposal can be planned well in advance. So in one of our works, with Texas A&M Chrisman Institute, which is a consortium of various oil and gas operators and service companies, we tried to figure out how we can take limited information, let's say well trajectory, formation evaluation data, which is the well logging data, and take some examples of completion parameters in production in the nearby region, and then create a map of excessive water production location. So that's one example where AI can preemptively predict and help better plan to reduce environmental impact. The other one is relevant to hydraulic fracturing stimulation operation, both in enhanced geothermal systems and in unconventional shales. We want to produce good fractures. When we produce these fractures, we want to know how are these fractures connected, because at the end, these connected fractures will be the flow path. So ensuring that we create connected fractures is an important thing. So for us to monitor our quality of fractures, what we generally do is microseismic data analysis. When we do microseismic data analysis, we can locate where is the event coming from. We can do some moment tensor analysis to understand the type of motion. On top of that, if we apply manifold learning, that's what I am bringing in. If we bring in manifold learning, then we can differentiate different types of fracture opening. So using that, we can identify large fracture openings, small fracture openings that are connected, fracture openings that are isolated, and all that helps us understand what will be the flow path. If we understand the flow path, then we can produce better or larger amount of heat from the subsurface in geothermal systems and more hydrocarbon in unconventional shales. And the final area where we can reduce environmental impact, enhance safety is CO2 enhanced DOR or carbon storage. So in that world, there are three important things that we want to understand. The first one is, will the CO2 leak? The second one is, how much will the CO2 spread? And the third one is, will the CO2 get trapped? So these three things need to be forecasted rapidly, given that there's a lot of uncertainty about the subsurface. So if we can forecast the intensity or the potential of leak, if we can forecast the spread of the CO2, or if we can forecast the trapping, how much of the CO2 will be trapped. If we can do all that, then it helps us improve our planning, helps us improve our drilling and injection schedules. And at the end, that leads to excessive oil production if you are doing CO2 enhanced DOR, as well as maximizing CO2 storage. Or in a traditional geological carbon storage, we can use this three forecasting to improve our amount of CO2 that is being stored underground safely for a long time. So these are three areas where I see AI coming in and reducing environmental impact and improving safety.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Dr. Garhi or Dr. Suleiman, if you could please let Nick Ashwin into a panelist, because he's still not able to talk right now. That will be appreciated. So please promote him into a panelist.
Okay, we'll get Ahmed to take care of it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I want to, sort of build on that, because some of what you described really relates to renewables. And my question I wanted to tackle is, how can AI then help us achieve a greener future, either by augmenting energy transition or by enabled in the first place. One thing I wanted to mention that is sort of unique a little bit about energy transition that I don't think many people appreciate is this idea of distributed generation and more complex grids and really much more stringent customer expectations is something that renewables will have to contend with. In other words, the idea of everything being vertically integrated as it is in traditional energy systems is actually quite challenged when you think about new energy systems. I mean, that's true across the board of, geothermal. Rarely will you find the generation, right next door to the consumption. And the same thing for CCS, and the same thing really for electrical grid in general. So you might imagine that the electrical grid of the future will be much more virtualized. In fact, the power plants of the future will be significantly more virtual than they are physical. And that actually opens up a lot of opportunities for data, for machine learning, for AI to really have an even greater role. So I think energy transition and digitalization are actually intimately linked. So I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, how then AI can help us achieve, a greener future in that context.
Well, I think I can go ahead, Hani, and answer that question. I think that's an area where we have been heavily focused lately, and I think we need to start by kind of looking at the big picture of what these kind of energy areas are solving. If we look, traditional oil and gas, we look at a bigger kind of energy or byproducts from energy demand as opposed to renewables. Renewables are really kind of tackling the electricity challenge, which I think we have two different challenges in parallel. When it comes down to renewables, and I'm going to talk specifically like geothermal hydrogen, I think the level of energy that will be transforming to electricity has major challenges compared with the barrels that we produce in the oil and gas industry to produce byproducts. So AI has a big role when it comes down to optimization. Optimization is probably more important in the renewable space than in oil and gas, without really underestimating the value of AI in oil and gas. But, if we go to the basics and we compare a barrel of water and a barrel of oil, the amount of energy that is produced from the barrel of water is substantially lower than the energy that you can produce from the barrel of oil. So that means that every barrel of water in geothermal really matters. And I'm talking about traditional kind of fluids production. There are different types of geothermal systems, but even if we think about heat extraction, any kind of level of heat that we can pull out of the hole, that will really make the difference, not only for electricity production, but in the general kind of financial component of the system. So AI has a big role around optimization for renewables. I'm giving the example in geothermal, but is equally applicable for hydrogen. So that's kind of the first level of value that we see from AI going into renewables. That's the kind of big component. So the second layer that we focus on is the significant substantial impact for decarbonization from renewables. So what's the difference in terms of emissions by producing X level of geothermal energy or X level of hydrogen energy compared with traditional fossil fuels? So AI has a really, really big role in terms of social education, in terms of climate change, to demonstrate why renewables really matters, not only from the electricity challenge that I was talking about, but also for climate change. So I guess, Hani, the first answer is optimization in renewables. I think it matters a lot more than in oil and gas or traditional oil and gas. That's why AI has a big role, and that can cover so many things within the complex system of a geothermal plant or a hydrogen plant. And the second level, I think, is climate change. I think there is a lot of education in terms of the kind of social awareness in terms of why renewables are really making the difference for decarbonization or net zero goals. And that comes down to forecasting, carbon emissions.
So Ashwin, maybe let me go to you since we're missing you for the last couple of questions. And the question is really, how can AI help us achieve a greener future? Augmenting energy transition and renewable technologies.
So the way I look at it, I think there was a lot of debate around whether the oil and gas industry is a part of the solution. I think we kind of laid that to rest. And the way I look at it is, we have the tools, we have the techniques, and we have the solutions to contribute towards a greener future. Right. One amongst them is carbon storage, CO2 injection, CO2 sequestration. So some of the areas that we think AI is accelerating is adoption of these technologies. When you implement some of these tools, one of the challenges is, how do you know whether when you're injecting CO2, the CO2 remains in there? What are the kind of surveillance tools that you could build on from there? So we primarily focus on, building some of these surveillance tools. How do you use pressure data, map it with machine learning algorithms to understand how the plume is migrating in that respect. So there are elements around surveillance when you actually execute the technology. And we believe that there are also elements around the planning stage itself, essentially, which wells to inject, where to inject. What we've seen is a lot of these processes are still heavily driven by our traditional workflows, which are, reservoir simulation based workflows. How do we accelerate some of those so that you can go back and say, how do I, given a geological model, how do I quickly get towards where should I ideally be placing these injector wells so that I can have long-term storage? So questions around, as Camilo mentioned, optimization is going to be huge. Questions around, surveillance are going to be huge. So as we try to address solutions which can help reduce our CO2 emissions, we believe that AI has an integral role to play in deployment of these solutions. So we're really excited about that.
That's a very interesting point both of you and Camilo brought up, which is the need for optimization is even more compelling. The reality is, in the early phase of capacity building, which is kind of where a lot of renewables are going through, optimization is underplayed. And typically, it's let's construct more and try and get the cost curve down. There's less emphasis on going through, and is this actually the overall optimum solution? So there's a severe lack, at least in my observation thus far, in systems thinking and systems optimization. And that's something actually that the oil and gas industry in particular, because of its longer history and because we've had to go down that cost curve for significantly longer. And of course, there aren't as many subsidies, at least nowadays, as there are in other sectors. The understanding of systemic modeling, the availability of data, historical data, and the availability of and the, I guess, robustness of simulation tools in conjunction with that is actually ahead. So there's a lot to be learned actually from what we do in oil and gas. And maybe there's an opportunity for you, Ashwin, to describe in a little bit more detail, because since we didn't have the opportunity earlier, what is it that you do at Resermine? What kind of flavors of AI do you actually employ? For what purpose?
Yeah, no, I think we were driven by the idea that we don't view necessarily AI as a replacement tool for decision making in the oil and gas industry, but for us it was more around augmenting, accelerating decisions, and we started focusing more around something what we call hybrid models. So essentially, when you couple these machine learning models with physics-based models, reduced physics-based models, it really opens up avenues that might not necessarily be addressed by individual models. So two specific applications that we focused on very early on when we started 8 years ago was more related to mature fields, mature conventional fields. So if you look at the big picture, 80% of all oil comes from mature fields. Most of them are water floods. And that translates directly to 80% of today's energy needs. So if you think about the way we are transitioning, there's going to be resistance developing new fields. So the emphasis is more going to be around mature fields. How do I increase production from those mature fields? What are the quickest and the cheapest way? The quickest and the cheapest way rather to increase the additional barrel is from these fields, right? Because you're already operating. So our focus was on mature fields, looking at how do I use data in the subsurface, given that I have a lot of data around injection, production, and use that as a basis to identify flow pathways that have already been formed. And the way we do that is using combination of different models. We have the reduced physics model, we have the machine learning model, combine them in unique ways. So that you're able to understand, how wells are being connected. So, as a lot of mature fields, you keep injecting, water is sweeping the remaining oil. What you really want is to avoid these recycling. So you're able to identify using these tools, which areas are more effective, which areas are not effective, to go back and suggest, redistribution of water. And so we kind of deployed these solutions across the world, here in the US, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia. And what we learned is it is really augmenting, I would say, the decision-making capability of the teams and helping them arrest declines in certain cases so that they are contributing towards additional production, which is much needed in the current environment. So that was one application that we looked at. The other application that we looked at is around field development planning. And I think you very earlier on emphasized this idea of a crew change, where everyone is beginning to do more with, less number of people. How do we accelerate? Typical field development plans take around 18 to 24 months. How do we cut down those cycles? So it turns out there are opportunities to combine simulation with machine learning approaches, add in something called the fast match models, which help you build these hybrid machine learning models. Think of them as proxy models, which help you map location to a recovery value. And that's where, as Camilo mentioned, advanced optimizers, plugging in directly can quickly tell you, where to ideally place the wells for maximizing NPV. So, optimum number of wells as well as their location. So what you're quickly doing is going from a single reservoir simulation file all the way towards an optimum with the well locations and trajectory, and really automating their entire space. So you're looking at cutting down 12 months of work with just a couple of weeks or up to a month of work, which you can again, go back and check in that respect, because you can use it and run simulations on the optimized file that you get to go back and check if that indeed the optimum. So those are, two main emphasis areas for us. We also have started embracing some elements of the generative AI space, where we are accelerating these field review, asset reviews that are typically done by these oil and gas companies. How do you train the data directly, use that as a basis to quickly know which wells are decreasing, which wells are increasing, and typical asset reviews that typically take a longish time can be shortened. So effectively, trying to identify which are the areas that traditionally have taken a longer time for us as an industry towards a decision, and trying to identify those technologies. So in summary, we are a company which has been more of a domain looking outward, saying, how can these tools help me accelerate what I'm doing within the domain? And that's primarily, we do.
Thank you, Ashwin. I'm going to go to you now, Sid, and ask you the same question. But perhaps before I do that, I want to share a question which is very relevant from one of the attendees. And basically the question, as a young engineer, his question or her question is around, should he or she, going forward, rely on this blend between traditional methods of production with AI, or completely replace that with AI? And I think we heard a bunch of the answer to that from you, Ashwin. But maybe since you work a lot with young folks as an educator, Sid, what would be your view on that?
Yeah, so the answer is you have to go hybrid, right? Why? Because we are engineers. As engineers, we have to have a very strong domain knowledge, which is driven by the physics, the chemistry, the maths. So we cannot just rely on AI alone. We need the hybrid approach. Now, let's say somebody decides to just stick to AI alone, machine learning alone, then the question is, you need a lot of high quality data. You need a lot of data that you have a complete understanding what this data means. So all that needs domain knowledge, all that needs hybrid thinking. So even if you decide to just stick to AI, you cannot let go of your engineering principles, which is again, have a foundation in the chemistry, the physics, the maths, right? Now, one thing I would like to say, kind of ending an answer to this question, is when we apply machine learning, right? We apply it on data, but just imagine, where is this data coming from? This data is coming from sensors that were placed by some engineers. Where were the sensors placed? They were placed in an infrastructure, a field. How was the field developed? It was developed by a group of geologists, a group of production people, a lot of financial support. So you need sensors, you need infrastructure. On top of that, you need a very good understanding of how this data that you're acquiring will go to the storage site. Maybe you will process the data through cloud. Maybe you'll process the data through a traditional desktop. So before you do data analytics, machine learning, there are layers and layers of strong engineering domains that come in. So how can you just do AI? That's my kind of a question to you to think. And the answer there is, you need a hybrid approach. You need to think how you can bring your strength, which is the engineering principle, into making the AI better and more efficient in solving your problems.
Thank you for that. And maybe I'll add a few perspectives here, because in addition to the work that I do advising startups mostly in the energy, in the industrial domain, I'm also kind of a micro angel investor across a number of other domains, including health tech, for instance. And what I've learned both in this last 3 years and before, when I was at Shell, is that what's fundamentally different about the industrial world, and to a very large extent the healthcare and other worlds where the implications of a decision are large, is that correlation, which is typically the goal of AI and machine learning in particular, is not good enough. Understanding causation, and importantly being able to explain that causation, is pretty important, in those businesses. Because, for example, if you're treating a patient, it's not just about the data you collect about the patient, but about the decisions that you make and why. You choose a path and why. So that's true in the clinical world. It's true also in the industrial world to a large extent. In addition to that, rarely do you have curated large sets of data, which is kind of the feedstock for classic machine learning as used, for instance, in the commercial consumer businesses, where in general you don't really care why a consumer buys a product. You just care that, if I put it on that shelf and present it in that way, that they'll buy more of it. You don't really care to know why is it that they buy it, right? In the industrial domain, generally speaking, you still have to explain why, even if it correlates very well, even if you could predict a lot of things, with few exceptions. For example, one of the notable exceptions is probably predictive maintenance, right? Which is a very interesting space for machine learning in particular, because through AI algorithms and data analytics, you can proactively monitor equipment performance, especially if that equipment is fairly routine and it lasts for a long time, like, a rotating piece of equipment, a pump or a compressor or something like that, or a sensor that is collecting data for maintenance purposes. Those kinds of things, maybe, perhaps, you can resort to kind of pure data analytics, whereas for most things that matter, for most decision-based purposes, allocating resources or stopping production or, anything more substantial, basically, then you really need a more hybrid approach. Okay? It's been my experience. So moving on then to the next question I wanted to delve into, and we kind of touched a little bit on that already, but what are some of the other misconceptions about AI that you routinely encounter in your work or in your interactions and you attempt to dispel? So, one of them, the most common one is, can we just use, a pure, let's say, data-driven approach across the board, for example? So we address that to some extent, but what else are some of those? Maybe start with you, Sid, since we just finished that.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, so one of the things that I would like to dispel, which I think is really hard to change, is machine learning is not AI. Deep learning is not AI. So that's my way of looking at it, right? So we as engineers, we as geoscientists, we use machine learning and deep learning in a very different way, which I will not be comfortable in calling it AI. But to make something commercially successful, commercially attractive, a lot of people, a lot of sellers, they use the word AI. So this is one thing that I would like to challenge and change. What is AI? AI is something that is very close to intelligence, right? So ChatGPT, I will consider it to be very close to being called an AI because it's working on natural language. It's working on things which are closer to human intelligence. But when you're working on a CSV data set or XLS data set where there are only numbers, the data is not unstructured, should we call it AI? I am not comfortable with that. Now, going ahead, even when we create a AI model or a machine learning model, remember that they have a life cycle. They have a life cycle. The model predictions will drift. So you cannot use it endlessly in any scenario. So we have to be careful on that. When should we use machine learning, right? Or when should we use deep learning? It's only very specific cases. I'll give you some conditions. Imagine that you are receiving a lot of data at a very high rate, and the data is coming through multiple channels, and the data is unstructured. So if these conditions are met, high rate, multiple channels, unstructured data, and your data is coming at a large volume, then definitely use machine learning, deep learning, because you don't have any other way of working with the data. But if your data is historical, the data is relatively small, will machine learning help? Maybe not. Why? Because machine learning is statistical correlation on steroids. So you'll have to be very careful in using it. It will fit your data. It will memorize the data. It can give you a good testing performance on your data, but that doesn't mean it will do well on the new data that you will get, let's say, a month later. So these are statistical correlations on steroids. So be careful. When you use them, you have to perform a lot of hyperparameter tuning to get your model that will scale and generalize well. And the final thing that I'll share based on my experience, everybody, when they come to the world of machine learning, they're very excited that, hey, we'll do machine learning, we'll build machine learning tools. But remember, 60% of my time, the people that I work with, 60% of our time goes in data pre-processing. Then 30% of time goes in model evaluation, trying to see what the model predicts. Is the model prediction aligned with engineering principles? Does it follow cause and effect relationships? So 60% in data pre-processing, 30% in model evaluation. So where is machine learning here? That model building that you're really fascinated about, that is just 10% of the work. So these are some of the things that I would like to share, and these are some of the things that people need to keep in mind when they're building the machine learning and deep learning solutions for engineering.
That's very insightful. Thank you. Camilo, maybe some of the misconceptions that you encountered as well.
Yeah, something that we deal pretty much in weekly, daily basis is the conception that this kind of digital tools will replace the human capabilities in the energy space. I think first, the domain expertise, the physics will always be there when we deal with these kind of complex systems in energy. I think, yes, there will be the requirements for an upskilling process as we continue evolving into all of these kind of digital applications. But I think the need for the expertise, the domain knowledge, the kind of engineering domain will always be there. So that's something that we try to talk about it in, like I mentioned before, weekly basis. It's really about providing optimization tools. It's about making the kind of processes faster and better. It's about really decision making. And it's really about reinforcing the engineering domain in order to really continue pushing the energy industry forward.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, just to add a couple of points, we also find something similar. In fact, when we work with companies, what we notice is that, Siddharth, you said 60%, in our case, it's been like almost 90-95% goes around, trying to get the data in place, in shape. And actually it turns out, and maybe, Camilo, you can verify, a lot of value that these companies have in working with, niche companies such as us is actually getting their data organized. You can build applications, down the road, but, having the ability to have data in one place really opens up doors towards, different stakeholders think about things differently. And then you can, build on applications from there. To the point on, trying to, these models replacing engineers, actually, that's something that we also faced very earlier on. Rather the acceptance of some of these tools. This goes back to the earlier point, Hani, you were making that, when you think about it, the domain is going to drive a lot of applications going forward. The ability to screen out that data, which is actually the 90% of the effort, the ability to screen out data, ability to identify which specific data sets make sense is going to, again, come from our engineering domain. As well as the ability to try to relate causal inferences coming in from these machine learning models. But regarding the replacement, we've always viewed this as an augmentation, and we actually see that happening. Some of these models break down. Just as an example, if you don't have fields which have a large amount of water flood data, some of our machine learning models are not effective. You have some other models that are effective in that space. When you start, looking at data where you just have started recently water flooding, what we notice is the machine learning models are more effective at picking up some of those signals. So in addition to, whether this augments, also identifying and knowing which areas they may not be applicable is also going to be something that we're going to learn as an industry. And it's very much going to be a part of our journey. And I think people, more than the processes, are going to form an integral part of driving this innovation. from my perspective. And we noticed that there's a lot more interest within the community to try and embrace some of these models. And we do take our role of also being educators a little seriously, where more number of people can know not just about advantages of machine learning, but also about shortcomings of some of these tools based on some practical applications. So,
yeah, no, thank you for those insights. It's quite interesting. Sometimes the debate about, and there's a lot of dilemmas really that are part of this whole digital space. One of which, for example, which I've encountered routinely, is you get sort of extreme views sometimes, which is, no, none of this is ever new. What's different between what we're doing now and what we've been doing forever? The reality is actually many of the fundamental ideas are very similar. AI itself in general as a concept is not completely new. It started out in the 50s really. But the approaches have gone back and forth. And in fact, machine learning wasn't really the main or primary flavor of AI for a long time. And there was quite a long AI winter, as they call it, throughout the 80s and early 90s. But it's really the availability of compute power, abundant sensors, the plummeting costs of storage, of communication, and of sensors that's really, made a huge change into what was possible with many of the same tools. But I like the way Sid, called basically machine learning is essentially correlation on steroids. Essentially, that's what it is. And importantly, there is a large subset of problems that are important, but are not really amenable to machine learning in general, at least not in the conventional approach. For example, prediction of safety incidents and that sort of thing doesn't work very well at all, because you're trying to predict the exception. And machine learning is mostly about the bell curve, the 90 percentile of things, not about predicting an exception in general, especially if there's not a lot of exceptions. Like rare high impact events don't work too well with this. So you'd have to use or invoke something else or some other alternative approach. And importantly, one of the dilemmas also is this idea of, once I will have all the data in one place, then we can do anything and everything. The reality is the data multiplies at a faster rate than we're actually able to get on top of it. As you mentioned, we're still spending 90 plus maybe percent of the time wrangling data. Why is that? Why is that data management and data, archival and retrieval hasn't advanced as fast as any of those other vectors? Because it's boring and it's difficult. And the fact is, data is multiplying every other year. It's doubling. So it's going to be very, very hard to get on top of data. Like, think of all the data generated by all these sensors, the trillions of IoT devices, as well as social media, which is constantly spewing endless data. It's actually very difficult to get on top of that data. No. So we can't just wait until we have all the data organized in something and then start to do something. No, we actually have to do both at the same time. And so constantly facing this dilemma of what can you do? What can you show the art of the possible, so to speak, and then start to transform that data into actionable intelligence and value. Because without doing that, you're sort of spinning our wheels, right? And you can just, form data lakes or lake houses or whatever, but at the end of the day, it becomes a data swamp if you can't really transform that into value. And we were, in this panel, we decided we weren't going to share any slides, but there's just one slide which I found fairly simplistic, but I think it's instructive just to share this one. So I'm just going to show it up here for everyone. I don't know if you can see it. Can you see this?
Yeah.
So very simple representation of what I think digital and AI is all about. Data, you feed it, then you get the insights, then there's the action, then there's the value creation. And importantly, the value creation needs to become value realization. This is kind of when you pick the fruit of that plant. So you sow the seeds, you get the aha moment, but that means nothing until there's actually value delivered. At least in a business context, that transformation is really important. Okay. I just wanted to share this one simplistic slide because I think it sums it up well in my view. Now, shifting gears a little bit, I guess, because there's no conversation about AI is complete these days anyway, without delving into generative AI, and you alluded to that a little bit, Ashwin, and so did Sid, because it's really all the buzz these days, and you've got Chat GPT, and so. Just to give a little bit of background for those of you who may not be familiar, which I don't know why, unless I guess you've been living under a rock, you would have at least heard of these. But generative AI in general is bringing, sort of a creative aspect to machine learning. And it's allowing it not just to analyze and interpret data, but also to generate new content potentially. Now, this content can take various forms: written word, visual images, music, and even the development of a digital environment, like writing code. Now, to understand the essence of generative AI, you really must delve into the realm of machine learning, which depending on how you look at it, is generally considered a branch of AI, which focuses on enabling computers to learn from experience, right? Now, traditional machine learning models learn from existing data to make, predictions or decisions, right? So they are discriminative. They classify input data into defined categories, and then they discover the correlation, more or less. But generative AI goes a step further, which is why, as Sid was saying, many consider that to be more akin to true AI than traditional machine learning has been. So, in a sea of data, or swamp of data, generative models tend to find out not just the patterns, but also sort of the underlying distribution that governs the data. So they utilize this knowledge then to generate new instances of the data that share the same characteristics of the original data. So a generative model trained on a data set of paintings, for example, can produce new images that echo, the artistic style that has been learned. And there's two significant types of generative models that have emerged now. There is generative adversarial networks, GANs, and then the other type is transformer-based models. Now, GANs use a construct which is like two neural networks. There's a generator and there's a discriminator, and they are pitted against each other in a sort of competitive game. And then the generator creates new data instances, and the discriminator evaluates them. And then over time, through this back and forth, the generator learns to create data that is almost indistinguishable from the real data. On the other hand, transformer-based models, like, for example, the popular generative pre-trained transformer model, which is GPT, that's what it stands for, GPT-3 and GPT-4 and so on, they use the concept of attention to generate text, which is contextually relevant. So they capture the dependencies between the words and their context in the text, and then that enables the generation of coherent and contextually accurate sentences. So while GANs have found wide application in image and music generation, transformer-based models have revolutionized text generation. So, really made a step change ever since the end of last year. And of course, the primary appeal of generative AI is in its creative potential. The idea of being able to compose music, to create visual art and things like that is very interesting. And, it's been disruptive. If you look at, for example, the funding, since I work a lot with in the startup domain, the funding that has gone into startups in general has been very low this last year. Historically low, let's say, lower than 10 years ago, except in the area of generative AI. It's actually gone much, much, much higher. So between generative AI and renewables, this is where the bulk of investment is going these days. So anyway, with that background, I want to turn to the panelists and sort of ask you what has been, your take on all this, and how might we leverage generative AI for the benefit of Earth, energy, and the environment in your perspective. So maybe starting again with you, Camilo.
Certainly, I think there will be so many applications across different segments. I think in our kind of or personal case, we have been using semantic search engines in order to structure the data that goes into the machine learning models. We have customers with data back from the 70s, from the 80s. Some of them are still kind of hard copies. So we were using semantic search engines connected to ORC technologies in order to digitize and structure the data that goes into the models. And I think that has been very instrumental for us. I think in terms of generative AI, there will be so many applications, obviously at different levels of operational, administration, and probably financial domains. But I will let the industry to kind of show us the path in that direction.
Ashwin?
No, I think, for us, as I said, we focused on trying to accelerate some of these processes. And we find that as a very exciting opportunity. And, what we believe is there are areas where one can accelerate, use of these generative AI models, but they need to be targeted towards specific applications. So rather than like a chat GPT where, you ask it anything and it's going to give you anything for that matter, there are, two specific cases that we worked on. One is, as I mentioned earlier on, asset reviews, which are typically done. So just to showcase an example, it kind of takes like 4 months to put together the background work for an asset review. And, you recall, Hani, in Deepwater, and I used to work in Shell Deepwater, it used to take at least a couple of months of dedicated reservoir engineers' time to, collect all the data, and you're dependent on one specific software to run the reports, to gather that data. And as Camille mentioned, but you also have the challenges that, not all of this data is either structured or is in one place. Different business units have, different formats of that data. So it turns out you can train these generative AI models directly on the database. So thereby, remove the dependency on these softwares. And now you can access data, run reports, plots, run relationships directly on data, and actually go back and customize dashboards around whatever specific things that you are trying to track. So this has, significantly brought down, I would say, the asset review times by 10 times. So, people are able to do that in a week's time, a couple of days' time. And it's also self-improving in the sense, if it doesn't work out, you can go back, check, help it determine whether that makes sense, doesn't make sense, and, kind of refine it. What's unique is it's not just a generic generative AI model, but also a generative AI model which has been fine-tuned towards some of these oil and gas based keywords that we typically use, so that you can avoid these hallucinations. So the technology is there, but fine tuning it towards specific applications is where we find a lot of value can be generated. And I'm sure we are just at the tip of the iceberg here.
Sid?
Yeah, so with ConocoPhillips, 2 years back, we started this work on trying to use generative AI for geomodeling. The whole objective is to speed up the geomodeling workflow. So in that, we used two methods. The first one is based on variational autoencoder. So there is a slightly advanced form which is called vector quantized variational autoencoder. So we use that to compress our training geomodels. So when we compress the training geomodels, we obtain latent representations, which are smaller representations of the geomodel. And on that latent representation, we'll train a autoregressive method. So I use two terms, variational autoencoder and autoregressive method. Both of them are generative AI solutions. They are generative models. Both of them build a probability distribution of the training data. By building a probability distribution of the training data, you can use that distribution to control new generations or to identify anomaly. So that's how this entire explicit generative modeling workflow works. What Hani was mentioning is an implicit generative modeling, which is GAN-based approach, which are pretty good for images. Diffusion-based approach is also a implicit generative model. You cannot access the probability distribution because you cannot access it. They're good for creation, but they are hard to control. So you have to decide based on what your end goal is, and then you can decide what foundational generative model you can use. For us, in that geomodeling workflow, we used variational autoencoder followed by autoregressive method to achieve rapid geomodel generation, which speeds up the workflow, let's say close to 100 times. But the constraint is we need at least 500 training geomodel realizations to truly understand all the variations that are there in the subsurface. And then we can rapidly generate more geomodels based on the constraints that we provide.
Thank you for that. Yeah, so this is a context of, sort of generative design, if you like, similar to what's used, for example, aircraft design and so on. So, and it's another very exciting space where AI can help. So, instead of randomly going through ideas, you can generate many different realizations much more rapidly, and then just choose which ones are the most appropriate. So this is a case study where AI really augments and accelerates. And I'm looking at the Q&A from the audience, and one question. Maybe I'll take those two questions. Basically, it's a very simple and basic question, but does AI or will AI affect future jobs of engineers in these industries? So I think the general answer is yes, but I suppose to what extent, in what way, would be really the discussion point. And one related question also, since Sid, you're in academia, is a question from one of the analysts, one of the attendants, is should we do our masters in something related to AI? Is that a good idea to understand, more about the methods by the time we graduate? What would be your recommendation, Sid?
Okay, so that's an interesting question. And again, my answer will be biased. Why? Because I'm a petroleum engineering faculty. I consider myself as an engineer, as a faculty in engineering. So what I would say is maybe not. You don't need, maybe. Okay, but this is a biased answer. Let me explain why. I was recently hearing a discussion on how ageism is affecting the jobs in AI and computer science. See, I don't have any proof of that, but this is based on reliable media, where what is happening is in the world of AI, computer science, software engineering, as soon as you hit, let's say, age of 35, you are considered to be slower than new people who are coming in. And on top of that, there are so many people who are getting trained in so many different computer science departments, electrical engineering departments, data science departments, statistics department. So I think it's a very, very competitive field that is creating talented people with a limited lifespan in the career. That's my personal point of view, and it's a biased point of view. Why? Because I'm coming from an engineering side. So my recommendation would be build a very strong foundation in the engineering that you love. If you love to engineer subsurface, petroleum engineering, geosystems engineering is what you should focus on. And as you're building your depth in engineering, use AI as a tool. You don't need to develop AI solutions, but use AI as a tool. For example, all these YouTube video creators, they are using YouTube as a tool. You don't have to create a YouTube app or YouTube web server. You don't have to do that. So use AI as a tool, have a very strong engineering domain knowledge, and then make yourself special, make yourself really good from the engineering side. That's my recommendation.
Okay.
Biased.
I guess we're all engineers here, so we will have that bias. But I guess one point of view is you could argue that a lot of the what AI is doing is replacing some types of jobs that are either simply intermediary functions, like one common function, especially that is talked about with generative AI in particular, is things like paralegals, right? Because essentially their job is, look up stuff and compose it and put it in one place, which in principle could be done. There will no doubt be some jobs that disappear and some other new things that will get created. Like, for example, prompt engineering is sort of a new type of engineering that's talked about in the context of generative AI. That just wasn't a thing before. And I'm sure in the future, new things will appear and some things will disappear. But I think the fundamentals is the thinking, the systemic thinking that's associated with an engineering education or with an earth science education. The ability to think of things as systems as opposed to, this disparate pieces of things is important regardless of what domain you work in, I think.
Yeah.
But I don't know your reflections on that, Ashwin.
I maybe a slightly different take. I think yes, of course. Domain is going to be important, and we can build on. It doesn't necessarily hurt to also have additional skills in AI, whether that is through a formal degree or whether that is through resources. Because going back to our earlier question, generative AI can also be a great tutor when you think about it. So you're looking at fundamentally different ways of educating yourself. It could be through a more structured approach of a degree, or perhaps looking at a problem and looking and trying to figure out solutions, like how most of the startups do. Along the road, and through that, learning something along. They say the best learning is when you're actually doing something. So seeking opportunities to say, okay, I'm doing this. Where are the areas where I could try to impact a change using these new models, thereby pushing yourself to learn, and that way that becomes a way to open up more doors in the future. From a career standpoint, and to us, based on our experience, I think that is what is really exciting, right? Where you can open up more doors. Where you've taken the initiative to say, okay, how do I, bring different disciplines together, and that has also been the focus of academia. As a former academic, you try to bring multiple disciplines together to, view things in a different perspective. So yes, it is still a tool, but it doesn't hurt to learn more, structured way of learning it, or perhaps an unstructured way of going about, figuring things out on the go, can also be very helpful.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think this whole idea of constantly learning and unlearning as through your entire life is something, going forward, we have to get used to. New generations have to go. Just the pace of change is that much greater. That the idea of just, learning something only in school and nothing else after is kind of expired in my view. And, the ability to continue to learn is going to be critical. So it doesn't have to be maybe a formal degree. Could be, but it doesn't have to. One other question, or general category of questions, is what are the long-term sort of societal, environmental, and ethical risks and impacts of AI? We talked a little bit about potential job, right? And maybe we don't need to exhaust that, but there is an impact on careers for sure. But what other aspects can you think of that we need to consider with AI? Particularly with the arrival of generative AI, the deep fakes, for instance, and even the ability basically to generate what looks like original writing, AI generated writing. So you might argue, for example, homework as we knew it might soon be over, and educators might need to adjust how to measure learning in different ways. So can you talk maybe from your perspective on some of those topics? Maybe starting with you, Ashwin. What are some of the things we need to do?
I think you rightly indicated, right? I mean, you have these, let's say generative AI generated text or, papers that are very assertive, that you end up questioning whether that indeed is true. So I think what is going to be critical is having or honing that critical thinking ability to go back and say, what are the checks that I could try to make, which can help me really, confidently take in some of those suggestions or those reports. Yes, I think education is going to fundamentally change the way I look at it. In terms of the broader societal application, my personal view is I don't think we fully realize the impact yet, because I think we are still, as an industry, trying to figure out how some of these models can be useful. It's a journey, and we don't necessarily know the bigger impact it might have on the society by itself. And it may be towards the positive, but it also may be towards the negative. So we don't know yet, is my opinion.
Camilo, maybe last comments?
Yeah, I think in the long term there are kind of low lights and highlights from AI when it comes down to ethics, moral, and social. I think from a consumer standpoint, everything that is related to making money out of data could be probably the question mark, more around data privacy, more about consumer behavior, for sure. And we have some kind of initial guidelines from the U.S. administration into the future when it comes down to AI. That was just this week, I believe. But I believe in the positive side, everything that is related with engineering, energy, especially specialized kind of AI knowledge for specific applications, I think would be probably the biggest benefit. So I think two sides of the question. Obviously, in the consumer side, large population kind of scale, that could be some questions mark. But in the specialized domain, I think there is actually more positive than negative going forward.
Well, let's ending maybe to sum it up. AI, promises a future which is sort of more democratized, distributed, data-driven, customer-centric, but not without challenges, which we'll still learn and learn how to deal with. But the future is really here and now, and we're in the midst of it. So thank you very much to all of you for your very valuable insights. I really enjoyed the conversation, and look forward to our future engagements in the years to come. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. This was a great panel. Thank you very much.